The Zephyrin Colossus was more myth than reality for most of the galaxy, a giant that roamed the frozen wilderness of Zephir Nine. It was said to have outlived empires and wars, its silhouette a ghostly relic in the mist-shrouded tundra. To the aliens who occasionally ventured near, the creature was a symbol of resilience, awe-inspiring yet untouchable. So, when whispers spread of its suffering, a festering wound that had turned it into a limping shadow, no one dared to intervene. Enter Dr. Elara Voss, a human veterinarian whose reputation for tackling impossible cases preceded her. She wasn't a military officer or a scientist chasing fame. She was simply a healer with an unyielding belief that every creature, no matter how large or alien, deserved compassion. When Elara first heard of the Colossus, she was aboard the Stellar Dawn, a small research vessel en route to an unrelated assignment. The crew laughed at the idea of a mere human attempting to approach the ghost of Zephir. "It's not just big, it's ancient," one of them warned. "If the ice storms don't kill you, the Colossus will." Elara had smiled at their warnings. If it survived this long, then it deserved someone willing to try. And so, against advice and common sense, she diverted her course to Zephir Nine. As the ship landed on the icy surface, the world outside was nothing but a blur of white, the howling wind threatening to swallow the light. Wrapped in layers of insulated gear and armed with nothing but her medical kit and an old holopad full of Earth veterinary techs, Elara stepped out into the tundra. For days, she tracked the creature, following faint trails left by its massive, limping gait. Finally, on the fourth day, she saw it, a towering silhouette against the blinding horizon, its fur matted with frost, its left forefoot swollen and cracked. It was the Zephyrin Colossus, and even in its agony, it radiated majesty. Elara approached cautiously, every step calculated. Her breath froze in the air as she stopped a safe distance away. The Colossus turned its massive head, its eyes, deep pools of blue, locking onto her. For a moment, Elara felt insignificant, a speck before an ancient giant. She raised her hands slowly, her voice steady. "I'm here to help you." The Colossus didn't move. It simply stared, its chest heaving with labored breaths. Elara knew that its stillness wasn't trust, it was exhaustion. This creature, the largest and perhaps oldest on the planet, had been brought low by pain, and Elara was determined to ease that pain. The first challenge was earning the Colossus's tolerance. Elara spent hours sitting nearby, speaking in low, calming tones. She showed it the tools in her kit: a scanner, antiseptic sprays, a portable laser scalpel, letting it smell and examine them from a distance. The Colossus didn't lash out, but its wary gaze never left her. By the second day, Elara began her work. Using a drone outfitted with imaging equipment, she analyzed the swollen foot. The abscess was worse than she had anticipated, a deep, infected wound that had likely begun centuries ago from a shard of alien glass embedded in the sole. The pain must have been unbearable, the creature's sheer size and stoicism masking a slow, relentless agony. "I've seen worse," Elara murmured, though the words were more for herself than the Colossus. She set to work cleaning the wound, starting with a simple antiseptic mist. The Colossus flinched, but didn't retreat. It watched her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being judged, not as a threat, but as a potential savior. The next step was removing the shard. Elara had no assistance, no advanced facilities, just her hands, her tools, and a makeshift operating field beneath a crude thermal canopy she'd erected to keep the worst of the cold at bay. As she activated the laser scalpel, the Colossus's ears twitched. "Easy," she said soothingly. "This might sting a little." The shard came out with a slow, careful pull, its jagged edges glittering darkly under the pale light. Blood and pus oozed from the wound, and Elara quickly irrigated it with a solution she'd synthesized from local plants and human medical supplies. The Colossus let out a deep, rumbling groan that reverberated through the icy plains. It wasn't a sound of anger. It was relief. Elara worked through the night, stitching the wound with an adhesive gel and wrapping the massive foot in a biopolymer bandage designed to withstand the planet's extreme conditions. When she finally stepped back, exhausted but triumphant, the Colossus lowered its massive head. For a moment, Elara thought it might be preparing to charge, but instead, it brushed its forehead gently against her chest. She froze, stunned by the gesture. It was unmistakable gratitude. From that moment, the Colossus's behavior changed. It allowed Elara to approach freely, even resting its weight near her camp as if seeking her presence. The once feral giant had acknowledged the human as an ally, and a bond began to form. What Elara didn't know, however, was that her actions had awakened something far greater than one creature's recovery. The echoes of the Colossus's pain calls were reaching across the icy plains of Zephir Nine, stirring the hidden and forgotten. The giant was not as alone as she had believed, and the galaxy would soon learn that a human veterinarian had done more than heal a wound. She had ignited a legacy. As the days passed, the Colossus, whom Elara had named Thorn, became both a patient and an enigmatic companion. The colossal beast was no longer wary of Elara's presence, though its movements remained slow and deliberate, weighed down by centuries of pain. Elara worked tirelessly to assess the full extent of Thorn's injury. Using her drones, she mapped the infected tissue and ran scans to understand how the abscess had festered for so long. The results were sobering. The infection had spread deep into the bone, and parts of Thorn's foot had deteriorated. Left untreated, the damage would eventually end the creature's life. Centuries of agony, Elara murmured as she reviewed the scans. And no one did anything. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with anger. Anger at the indifference of the galaxy. She stared at Thorn, who stood nearby, its massive frame outlined against the icy expanse. The Colossus's gaze met hers, and for a moment, Elara felt as though the creature understood her resolve. "You're not dying on my watch," she vowed. Elara began preparing for what she knew would be the most challenging procedure of her career. The infection needed to be excised, the abscess drained, and the damaged bone replaced with a biosynthetic graft. But her supplies were limited, and her makeshift operating field was far from ideal. She had to innovate. Chapter 2. The Frozen Legacy Awakens. The operation had been a success, but Elara knew Thorn's recovery was just beginning. The Colossus, though no longer burdened by the shard embedded in its foot, still moved with caution, testing its new biosynthetic graft like a child learning to walk. The first few days were spent ensuring that the wound showed no signs of infection. Every morning, Elara inspected the bandages and applied the gel she'd crafted to accelerate healing. The mammoth's trust, fragile at first, had grown to something profound. Thorn would lower its massive head as Elara worked, its deep blue eyes watching her with an eerie intelligence. But something else was stirring in the tundra, a presence she couldn't yet identify. It began on the 5th night. Elara sat by her campfire, her exhaustion barely kept at bay by a steaming cup of nutrient broth. Thorn lay a short distance away, its massive form a reassuring shadow against the horizon. But as the wind shifted, Elara felt a strange vibration in the ground. She froze, her hand hovering over the mug. The tremor wasn't from Thorn. It was distant but deliberate, a rhythmic pounding that resonated through the icy plains. Thorn's ears twitched, and its head lifted sharply. "What is it, big guy?" Elara whispered, standing. The vibrations grew stronger, accompanied by a low, mournful sound that rolled through the tundra like distant thunder. Thorn answered with a deep, resonant bellow that seemed to shake the very air. Elara's heart raced. That's not just the wind. The sound wasn't a warning or a challenge. It was a call, one Thorn seemed compelled to answer. The mammoth rose to its full height, its newly mended leg holding steady as it began to lumber toward the source of the noise. "Wait, Thorn, you're not ready to walk that far yet," Elara called, grabbing her coat and medical kit. She scrambled to keep up, the freezing wind biting at her face as the Colossus forged ahead, its massive steps carving fresh trails in the snow. For hours, they moved across the frozen expanse, the mysterious sound growing louder and more distinct. Elara felt her body screaming in protest, her legs threatening to buckle under the strain, but she pushed on. Thorn was resolute, its pace unwavering despite the journey's toll. When they crested a ridge, Elara gasped. Below them lay a massive valley blanketed in pristine white, but it wasn't the landscape that stole her breath, it was the gathering. Dozens of massive shapes moved through the snow, their fur shimmering with frost. They were mammoths, each as colossal and ancient as Thorn, their mournful calls echoing into the night. Elara stared in stunned silence. She'd assumed Thorn was the last of its kind, a lone survivor of a forgotten species. But here, in this hidden valley, the Zephiran colossi had endured. Thorn let out a powerful bellow, and one by one, the other mammoths turned their massive heads toward the ridge. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a smaller mammoth broke from the herd, limping toward Thorn. Its movements were awkward and pained, one of its legs bent at an unnatural angle. Elara's breath hitched. Another injury. She looked up at Thorn, whose eyes remained fixed on the limping mammoth. "You brought me here, didn't you?" she murmured. "You knew they needed help too." Thorn let out a soft rumble, lowering its head as if acknowledging her words. Taking a deep breath, Elara began descending the ridge, her heart pounding. This was no longer just about Thorn. It was about an entire species that had been neglected, left to endure centuries of suffering in the shadows. The injured mammoth stopped a few paces away, its gaze wary but desperate. Its bent leg was clearly broken, the bone protruding slightly beneath the fur. Elara knelt and opened her medical kit, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the enormity of the task ahead. "You've done this before," she told herself, steadying her breath. "You can do it again." Thorn stood nearby, a silent guardian as Elara approached the injured mammoth. She spoke softly, her voice carrying over the howling wind. "I'm here to help you, just like I helped him." The mammoth didn't retreat, but its eyes remained fixed on her every movement. Slowly, Elara began her assessment, using her drone to scan the leg. The fracture was severe, but it was treatable. She'd need to realign the bone and create a splint strong enough to support the creature's weight. As she worked, the other mammoths gathered, forming a loose circle around her. Their sheer size was overwhelming, their presence both awe-inspiring and intimidating. But they didn't interfere. They simply watched, their deep, resonant calls rumbling through the air like an ancient song. Hours passed as Elara worked tirelessly, her fingers numb from the cold. She used every resource she had, her portable laser scalpel to clean the wound, biopolymer gel to seal it, and strands of ice vine to bind the makeshift splint. The injured mammoth remained still, as if understanding that her actions were meant to heal, not harm. When she finally stepped back, her body aching with exhaustion, the mammoth let out a low, rumbling sound. Thorn answered with a similar call, and the two creatures pressed their foreheads together in a gesture that seemed almost ritualistic. Elara wiped the sweat from her brow, her breath visible in the freezing air. "One down," she said softly, looking around at the other mammoths. "How many more of you need help?" As if in response, a mammoth at the edge of the herd let out a deep, sorrowful bellow, limping forward to reveal a missing tusk and a gaping wound along its flank. Elara's heart sank, but she refused to give in to despair. She turned to Thorn, who stood tall and steady beside her. "Looks like we've got a lot of work to do, big guy." For the first time, Elara truly understood the magnitude of what Thorn had led her to. This wasn't just about saving one life. It was about giving an entire species a chance to heal, to endure, to thrive. And as the frozen wind howled around her, Elara felt a spark of hope. The galaxy might have neglected these creatures for centuries, but she wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 3. The Call of the Forgotten Herd. The days that followed became a blur of relentless work and fleeting moments of wonder. Elara's camp transformed into a makeshift field hospital on the frozen plains. With Thorn as her ever-watchful ally, She began treating one mammoth after another. Each creature bore its own scars, fractures, festering wounds, twisted tusks. But their stoic endurance reminded her of Thorn, and she felt a renewed determination with every step. Wordless understanding passed between her and Thorn, as if the colossus had taken it upon itself to shepherd her mission. When a mammoth hesitated, Thorn would approach, rumbling softly, nudging the reluctant creature toward Elara. It wasn't just trust anymore. It was a partnership. One morning, as she bandaged a smaller mammoth's wounded flank, Elara noticed something strange. The herd had stopped its usual low hum of calls, and an eerie quiet settled over the tundra. Thorn, who had been standing beside her, turned abruptly, his massive ears flicking forward. "What now?" Elara muttered, standing and squinting into the distance. A faint shimmer on the horizon caught her eye movement. But this was no natural phenomenon. A procession of dark figures appeared, emerging from the swirling snow like ghosts. Their shapes became clearer as they drew closer. Humanoid, tall and sinewy, clad in thick, ornate robes that seemed ill-suited to the harsh cold. Each figure bore the unmistakable iridescent sheen of alien skin, their faces obscured by elaborate masks. They carried staves that pulsed faintly with energy, like ancient artifacts imbued with technology beyond her understanding. Elara's pulse quickened. She stepped forward instinctively, placing herself between Thorn and the approaching aliens. "Stay calm, big guy," she whispered. "Let's see what they want." The lead figure stopped a few paces away, raising a long-fingered hand in a gesture of greeting. When they spoke, their voice was resonant, almost musical, yet underpinned by an unmistakable authority. "You are the human," the alien said, their words slightly accented but perfectly intelligible. "The healer of the beasts." Elara didn't lower her guard. "That's me. And you are?" The alien tilted their head, as if amused. "We are the caretakers of the eternal beasts, guardians of the Zephiran Mammoths, as we have been for millennia." Elara frowned, her eyes flicking to Thorn and the other mammoths. Their body language was cautious, but unafraid. "Caretakers," she repeated, her tone sharp. "Where were you when they were suffering? When they were limping and dying in the snow?" The alien's posture stiffened, but they didn't seem offended. "We did not abandon them," the caretaker replied calmly. "We watched. We waited. Intervention disrupts balance, and their resilience is sacred. Only in dire need do we act." "Resilience?" Elara's voice rose with disbelief. "You let them endure centuries of pain because you thought it was sacred? That's not care. That's neglect." A low rumble sounded from Thorn, as if the mammoth echoed her indignation. The caretaker's gaze shifted to the massive creature, their glowing eyes narrowing. "You misunderstand, human," the alien said, their tone now cold. "We preserve what must endure. Their suffering is part of their survival." Elara took a step forward, her hands tightening into fists. "No, their suffering is what almost killed them. Thorn, this one, was limping, dying alone until I pulled a shard of glass out of its foot. And the others? Their injuries are because no one helped them when it mattered. Don't tell me you care about their survival when you've done nothing to ease their pain." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle like the ice beneath their feet. Then another figure stepped forward, their voice softer, more hesitant. "Perhaps the humans speak some truth, Lyrash. We have been watchers, not healers. And now, the herd gathers as if in response to this outsider's efforts." The lead caretaker, Lyrash, hesitated. Their masked face turned toward the injured mammoths scattered around Elara's camp. Thorn stood tall among them, his repaired leg a silent testament to her skill. "This is unprecedented," Lyrash admitted at last. "The herd has not gathered in such numbers for generations. The mammoths have always been solitary creatures. Maybe because they've been too hurt to find each other," Elara shot back. "Thorn brought me here because he knew they needed help. If you truly care about these creatures, then help me. Don't just stand there." The caretakers exchanged glances, their staves pulsing faintly. Finally, Lyrash nodded, though their posture remained tense. "Very well, human. Show us what you have done. Perhaps we can learn from your methods." Elara felt a flicker of surprise. She hadn't expected them to concede so quickly. "Fine," she said, waving them over. "But let me be clear. This isn't about tradition or sacred suffering. It's about saving lives." She led them to her most critical patient, the mammoth with the shattered tusk and gaping wound along its flank. As she explained her process, cleaning, sealing, and fortifying the injury with materials both alien and improvised, the caretakers watched in silence. Their expressions, hidden behind their masks, remained inscrutable, but their focus was undeniable. When the procedure was complete, Lyrash stepped closer, their voice quieter now. "You work with ingenuity, adapting your tools to the environment. It is not how we have cared for them in the past." "Because your past methods weren't enough," Elara replied bluntly. "If you're serious about helping these creatures, then stop clinging to what didn't work." Lyrash regarded her for a long moment. Then, they turned to Thorn, who stood nearby, his massive frame towering over them both. "You have done more for this herd in days than we have in decades," the caretaker admitted. "Perhaps the mammoths called you here for a reason." Elara folded her arms. "I don't know about destiny or calls, but if you're willing to learn, I'll teach you. These creatures deserve better, from all of us." Lyrash nodded, their mask dipping slightly. "Agreed. Let us begin." As the caretakers joined her efforts, Elara felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this alliance, born of necessity and stubborn compassion, could ensure that the Zephiran Mammoths would no longer suffer in silence. And for the first time, as the herd's mournful calls rose into the frozen air, Elara thought she heard something new in their voices, the echo of a future, not of pain, but of promise. Chapter 4. The Herd's Awakening. Weeks passed on the icy plains of Zephir Nine, and the tundra that once echoed only with the mournful cries of suffering beasts began to resonate with something new: hope. The caretakers, under Elara's guidance, embraced a more active role, learning to treat the mammoths with both reverence and practicality. For the first time in centuries, the great herd stood together as one, healed in body and spirit. Thorn had become a central figure among the herd, his newly mended leg a beacon of resilience. Wherever he roamed, the other mammoths followed. Elara often found herself marveling at the way the colossus moved now, not with the slow, pained gait of an injured relic, but with a purposeful grace. But as the days grew longer, Elara knew her time on Zephir Nine was nearing its end. Supplies were running low, and the Cirrus Dawn had signaled that it would return soon to retrieve her. She stood on the crest of a frozen ridge, watching the herd below, their massive forms silhouetted against the pale sun. Lyrash approached silently, their tall frame casting a long shadow across the snow. "You've done more than heal them," the caretaker said, their voice quiet but filled with something almost like admiration. "You've reminded us of our purpose." Elara gave a soft laugh, her breath misting in the frigid air. "I didn't do it alone. Thorn led me here, and you stepped up when it mattered." She glanced at Lyrash. "That's what counts." The caretaker hesitated before speaking again. "And yet, you must leave?" Elara nodded. "Yeah, my ship will be here soon. But the herd is strong now, and so are you." For a moment, Lyrash said nothing, their gaze fixed on the herd below. Then, they turned to her, their mask catching the faint light. "There is something you should see before you go." Curious, Elara followed Lyrash down the ridge and into the heart of the herd. The mammoths parted as they approached, their massive heads dipping in quiet acknowledgement. Thorn was at the center, his towering form surrounded by the others. As Elara drew closer, she noticed something unusual, a faint glow emanating from the snow beneath his feet. "What is that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Lyrash knelt and brushed the snow aside, revealing an ancient, crystalline structure embedded in the ice. The glowing patterns carved into its surface pulsed faintly, as if alive. "It is the heart of the herd," Lyrash explained, "a relic from the age when the mammoths first roamed this world. It has been buried for centuries, waiting for the herd to gather again." Elara stared at the artifact, its intricate designs mesmerizing. Why is it glowing now? The herd's unity has awakened it, Lyrash said. It is a sign that their bond is restored, and their legacy will endure. And you, human, are part of that legacy. Elara felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked at Thorn, whose deep blue eyes seemed to hold a world of understanding. The mammoth stepped forward, lowering his massive head until his forehead gently touched her shoulder. "You're welcome," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. As she stepped back, the glow from the heart of the herd intensified, spreading across the ice like a ripple of light. The mammoths began to rumble softly, their calls harmonizing into a sound that was both ancient and new. The tundra itself seemed to respond, the ground vibrating with a quiet power. Elara turned to Lyrash. "Take care of them, all of them." The caretaker inclined their head. "We will honor their legacy, and yours." When the Cirrus dawn arrived the next day, Elara stood at the edge of the landing site, watching as the herd faded into the distance. Thorn paused briefly, turning his massive head to look back at her one last time. Then, with a low rumble, he disappeared into the snowy horizon. As the ship's engines roared to life and the frozen world fell away beneath her, Elara felt a strange mix of sadness and fulfillment. The Zephiran Mammoths would no longer be neglected relics of a forgotten age. They were a living, thriving legacy, and she had been part of their rebirth. For the rest of her life, Elara would carry the memory of the frozen plains, the towering beasts, and the bond she had forged with a creature whose suffering had sparked a revolution. And as the stars stretched out before her, she smiled, knowing she had left behind not just healed bodies, but a renewed hope for an entire species. The end.